Hello, welcome to first training session. In this video, we're going to be covering something that comes up surprisingly often whilst providing medical care, which is mental capacity. Decided that we should probably do some training on this, so you'll see some new sections where you can basically watch training videos like this, and that will sign you off on your training. So, imagine you're treating someone at an event. Okay, and their observations are concerning, and you believe that they need further medical assessment. But they say to you, I'm fine, leave me alone, I'm going home. Can they refuse the medical assessment? What if they've been drinking? What if they've taken drugs? What if they're confused? And what happens if you genuinely believe they're putting themselves at serious risk? The situations can obviously become difficult very quickly. That's something that we experienced recently at a recent event. But the important thing to remember is that capacity isn't about whether we agree with someone's decision. It's about whether that person is able to make that particular decision at that particular time. So we're in England. So in England and Wales, our approach is based on the Mental Capacity Act of 2005. And hopefully by the end of this training video, you should understand how to recognise when capacity may be impaired, how to assess it, and what to do if someone lacks it. But most importantly, how to document what you've done. There's 5 fundamental principles within the Mental Capacity Act, and the first is extremely important. So a person must be assumed to have capacity unless it is established that they lack capacity. Okay, so we don't assume people don't have capacity. So we don't start an assessment trying to prove someone doesn't have capacity. Our starting position is that they do. We always start with that they have capacity. Second, a person must be given all practical help to make the decision themselves before we decide that they cannot. So that might mean explaining things a little differently, giving them more time, moving somewhere quieter, using simpler language, using pictures or some other form of communication, or involving someone who can help them communicate, family member or a friend. The third is that a person isn't to be treated as unable to make a decision simply because they make an unwise decision. It might be unwise, but they still have capacity. That's obviously very important. People are allowed to make decisions even if you and me think that they're terrible. So if I understand that I could become seriously unwell by refusing hospital treatment, but I understand that risk, and I decide I'm still not going, that doesn't mean I lack capacity. It's an unwise decision, but people with capacity have the right to make unwise decisions. And the fourth, anything done for someone who lacks capacity must be done in their best interests. The fifth, we should choose the least restrictive option. So we shouldn't restrict someone's freedom more than is genuinely necessary. Okay. When do we assess capacity? And that is the whole idea on in training and making you more aware of it. So we're not expected to perform a formal capacity assessment on every single patient that we see. Most patients can make all of their own decisions perfectly well. 9 out of 10 will come in and you'll have no issues. But there might be reasons where you need to question their capacity. So, for example, they might seem confused. They might be like significantly intoxicated on alcohol or drugs, under the influence of drugs, experiencing a head injury, being unconscious, semi-conscious, mental health crisis, hypoxia, hyperglycemia, or another illness affecting their ability to think clearly. But there's an important distinction, is that having one of those conditions doesn't automatically mean someone lacks capacity. Being drunk doesn't automatically remove your capacity. Having dementia doesn't remove your capacity. Having a learning disability doesn't automatically remove your capacity. Having a mental health condition doesn't remove your capacity. You get the point. We still assess the person's ability to make the particular decision. So capacity is decision specific. It's not something someone simply has or doesn't have. It's based on that decision. It is both decision specific and time specific. So if someone might have the capacity to decide what they want to eat, for example, but not have capacity to understand a complicated decision about medical treatment. So someone's capacity can change. A patient who is severely hyperglycemic, for example, may temporarily lack capacity because their sugars are low. After their treatment and their sugars come up, their cognitive function probably starts to come back and they regain that capacity. The question then isn't, does this person have capacity? It's more than likely going to be, does this person have capacity to make this particular decision right now? And we will look at that in a two-stage test. So the Mental Capacity Act gives us a two-stage test to use. Stage 1, we consider whether there is an impairment or disturbance in the functioning of the mind or the brain. That could be temporary or permanent. It could be a head injury, it could be dementia, it could be intoxication, drug use, hypoxia, a neurological condition, delirium, anything like that. But identifying that impairment isn't enough by itself, so we have to move on to stage 2. Stage 2, so because of that impairment or a disturbance, is that person unable to make that particular decision? And this is where we actually test their decision-making ability. And there's 4 parts of decision making. For someone to make a decision, they have to be able to do 4 things. They need to understand, they need to retain, they need to use or weigh, and communicate. So if we look at these individually, understand. First, can the patient understand the information relevant to the decision? So, suppose we're recommending hospital because we're concerned about a condition. Instead of asking, do you understand? Have them explain it back to you. So, Doris, can you tell me what we found today? Or, Pete, can you explain why we're recommending that you go to hospital? Then we have evidence that they've actually understood the information that we've given them. Then they need to retain. So can they retain that information long enough to make that decision? They don't have to remember everything permanently. They only need to retain the relevant information long enough to use it in that decision making. All right, it's particularly important with conditions causing any sort of short-term memory problems or confusion. Then we come to use or weigh. So this is where things become important clinically. Can they actually use and weigh the information when making their decision? So, Doris, we found that your blood pressure is extremely low and we're concerned that you might become seriously unwell. What do you think could happen if you don't go to hospital? And we're looking at whether they are able to appreciate the consequences and balance those consequences against their decision. Them just repeating that information back, that's not enough. They need to be able to use that information when reaching their decision. All right, and then they need to communicate. So it doesn't have to be verbal. They might communicate via writing, sign language. You might have someone that can't, deaf, for example. Gestures, any sort of communication aids, eye movements, anything really that's reliable. But we should make reasonable efforts to enable someone to communicate before deciding they cannot. It's not an orientation test, so remember that. Capacity isn't just what's your name, where are you, what day is it. Someone could answer all of those correctly and still be unable to understand or weigh the consequences of a particular medical decision. So someone could get the date wrong and still have perfectly adequate capacity to decide whether they want treatment. Orientation can form part of your clinical assessment, but orientation and capacity are not the same thing. So let's look at an example. Let's go with intoxication, right? So you're treating a patient at an event and they've consumed a significant amount of alcohol or recreational drugs. Their observations are concerning and you recommend further assessment at hospital. and they say, no, I'm leaving. The wrong approach to that would be, oh, they're intoxicated, they don't have capacity. Instead, assess them. So explain what you're concerned about, explain what you're recommending, and explain the potential consequences of refusing. Ask them to explain all of that back to you. Did they understand what you told them? Did they retain it? Did they weigh those risks up? And did they communicate it back to you clearly? If they can, they may still have capacity even though they're completely intoxicated. If the intoxication means that they're unable to understand or weigh up that information, then they might lack capacity for that particular decision. Let's have another example. So an unwise decision, okay? So we're another patient completely. They're completely alert. They understand everything you've told them. You explain that you're concerned about their symptoms and recommend hospital assessment. They explain back to you exactly what you're worried about. They understand that refusing could result in serious deterioration. But they say, I understand, and I'm still not going. You might strongly disagree with them. You might think they're making a really bad decision. But they understood, they retained, they weighed up the decision, and they communicated it back to you. So that deems them to have capacity. Someone with capacity generally has the right to refuse treatment, whether we think that's right or wrong. Let's do a third, shall we? So let's go with a completely unconscious patient. So imagine someone's collapsed in front of you, or you've been called to a collapse. They're unconscious and they require emergency treatment. Clearly, they're unable to make or communicate a decision, right? So treatment may therefore need to be provided in their best interests, subject to those circumstances and any relevant advanced decisions or any other legal considerations. The aim there is to provide necessary treatment while using the least restrictive intervention appropriate to that situation. What if they lack capacity? What do we do if they lack capacity? So we've gone through all of our steps, and if you reasonably have established that someone lacks capacity for their particular decision, the next question becomes, now what is in their best interests? But that doesn't mean what do I think is in their best interests. That means we should start considering any previous expressed wishes, their values, their beliefs, information from their friends or their family, how urgent the situation is right now, the risks of acting on it, the risks of not acting on it. And in an emergency, there might not be any time for lengthy discussions, but our actions should still then be necessary and proportionate, but focused on that patient's interests. Now, we move on to restraint, and this is an area we have to be particularly careful. All right. Now, finding someone lacks capacity doesn't give anyone authority to physically restrain them. Any restriction or restraint must have a lawful basis, all right, and be necessary and proportionate to the risk of harm. As Richard's Medical, if we're dealing with a patient who lacks capacity and is attempting to leave despite a significant risk of harm, this should generally trigger early escalation. So we would request appropriate clinical support. So in that situation, for us at least, we probably should be calling an ambulance. And if there is an immediate safety issue, then the police would be sometimes necessary. There is no reason ever to turn a clinical disagreement into a physical confrontation at all. Refusal with capacity. So let's go opposite. Consider now the opposite situation. We've assessed the patient. They have capacity. They still refuse your recommendation. What do? You explain your concerns clearly. You explain what you're recommending. You explain the reasonably foreseeable consequences of refusing. And you give appropriate safety netting advice. You tell them what symptoms should prompt them to seek medical assistance. And you document that conversation. Everything should be documented. A signed refusal form can support a documentation, but a signature itself doesn't have anything to do with capacity. Our assessment, however, does. So remember the assessment. Now, going back to documentation, this is the most important practical parts of this. Don't write on your paperwork, patient has capacity. That's just not enough. You document why you've reached that conclusion. So, patient advised that further assessment at hospital was recommended due to abnormal observations. Patient was able to explain the concerns raised and repeat the potential risks of declining further assessment. And the patient was able to retain and weigh this information and communicated in a consistent decision to decline hospital treatment. That covers you completely. All right, so it gives someone reviewing that record, if it ever happened, evidence of how you actually came to assess their capacity. It's likewise, if someone lacks capacity, you document what they couldn't do. So, patient unable to demonstrate understanding of the risk discussed and repeatedly unable to retain information regarding the proposed treatment. Common mistakes. Don't ever assume anyone lacks capacity simply because they're drunk or high or whatever. Don't assume someone lacks capacity because they have a mental health condition. Don't assume capacity because someone knows their name, location, and date of birth. Don't confuse an unwise decision with an incapable decision. And don't simply just say, "Do you understand me?" Test their understanding. Don't write "has capacity" on the PRF without documenting the evidence that supports that conclusion anyway. Let's bring it all together. Start by presuming capacity. If you have a reason to question it, identify that specific reason and the specific decision that needs to be made. Ask yourself, is there an impairment or a disturbance affecting their mind or brain? Then determine whether, because of that impairment, that person is unable to make that decision in that moment of time. Remember the 4 things we were assessing. Understand, retain, use or weigh, and communicate. We give the patient every reasonable opportunity to make the decision themselves. We're not looking to class someone as lacking capacity. Remember that people with capacity are allowed to make decisions that we consider unwise. If someone lacks capacity, decisions made on their behalf must be in their best interests and should use the least restrictive appropriate option, and document everything. Capacity assessments aren't about whether someone agrees with us. They're about whether that person can make that decision at that time. All right, and it's a clinical, we're doing it because of the patient's best interests at the end of the day. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.